Hi students, it's your instructor Anna Otto. Just wanted to pop on screen and say hi before I go over the content I want to share. Okay, thanks. So this will be a real quick overview of Unit 3, which is adulthood, the adulthood chapters, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. Unit 3 actually ends with a chapter about the end of life. So just to put it in perspective, even though we're covering fewer age periods than we would with childhood, meaning the infancy, toddlerhood through adolescence period, we're actually covering a lot more time. So we're covering from the ages of 18 years of age, when one, at least in the US, is considered to reach adulthood, all the way until the end of life, which on average is about 78 years, plus or minus a few years for an average life expectancy in the US. So we're going to go through each of the domains, starting with the physical domain. One term that you'll first see come up in the early adulthood chapter is senescence, and senescence is biological aging. Do you remember when that begins? That's right. It actually begins in early adulthood, which just seems crazy to think of aging beginning in adulthood. So we see development, growth up until sometime in early adulthood. And I say sometime because it depends on exactly what skill, what system we're talking about. But in general, decline or senescence, biological aging, begins in early adulthood. When we think about this idea of senescence beginning in early adulthood, though, it's really important to distinguish between measurable and functional declines. So what we tend to see in early adulthood are measurable declines. The cardiovascular system starts to decline, but we don't typically notice it under normal conditions. But if we're put under strenuous conditions, particularly when they do research in labs and they're hooking up the heart and the lungs to measure their capacity and then having one exert extreme physical stress, that's when you'll notice the declines. Have to be careful too, because in early adulthood we see some commingling of effects. So most people, once they get to early adulthood, have less free time, less leisure time than they did in adolescence and childhood in general. So sometimes we'll see people maybe not as physically strong as they were previously because they're not as active or training as much as they were. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about declines because of the decreasing capacity of the system. As we go through the adulthood years, from early adulthood to middle adulthood and into late adulthood, we start to see more functional decline. So functional meaning you can feel it, you can tell it's impacting the function. So again, early adulthood declines tend to be measurable but not functional. Middle adulthood, start to notice a little bit more. I'm in middle adulthood and I notice that some things, including my joints, aren't quite as flexible as they used to be. So if I sit too long in one position, sometimes I stand up and it's like, oh, okay, I can feel that. That's more of a functional decline, and certainly becoming winded in doing normal exertion. That would be a functional decline. That's something that would be more characteristic of late adulthood. Reproduction and climacteric is another topic that comes up. So reproductive ability arrives in adolescence. That's the hallmark of puberty, that process of puberty leading up to reproductive maturity and adult-sized stature. In early adulthood, that tends to be the prime time for reproduction, or at least up until the middle of the 30s in women in particular. We do start to see some slowing of reproduction evident even before that, though. But what that usually means in early adulthood is that rather than getting pregnant in a month if you're trying to, it might take a few months to get pregnant when you're trying to get pregnant. By 35, we start to see increased risk from pregnancy, so an increased risk of complications. One in particular that we've talked about before is trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. There is an increase in incidence of Down syndrome in moms that are over 35. It's referred to kind of the historic term geriatric pregnancy. Now you'll more often hear mother of advanced maternal age. That means a woman who's still reproductively viable but over 35 because of the increased risk. Probably do some more testing and monitoring to make sure that mom and baby are safe. Climacteric then is the slowing and in women eventual stoppage of reproductive ability. So women in middle adulthood, sometime in the 50s typically, reach menopause or cessation of menstruation. Men don't typically have a cessation or a complete stoppage, but they do have a slowing. Mortality is another topic that we see come up, particularly as we're looking toward the late adult years, but we'll look at numbers and death rates in each of the age periods, and please notice the trends. So death in early adulthood is most often because of some type of accident or injury. We start to see disease becoming more common in middle adulthood, and the most common cause of death as we move into late adulthood. And we'll talk more about mortality trends as we go through the adulthood chapters. And then the last one here for physical domain, the physical domain is the idea of keeping healthy. So I always say kind of the big three, if you will: diet, exercise, and sleep. Diet, what you eat, eating good, healthy foods, eating enough of the right foods, not eating too much food. Exercise, making sure particularly impact exercises that helps to keep the bones healthy and helps to keep the muscles healthy, as well as the brain healthy. And adequate sleep is very important. In the adult years, 7 to 8 hours is the typical amount of sleep that's needed. But many adults, particularly in early adulthood, with all of the stresses that can go along with that, are not getting adequate sleep. And that can actually cause problems. It interferes with the proper functioning of our systems. We'll also come across a few other things like reducing substances, making sure not to abuse alcohol, reducing stress that help with keeping healthy. But I always say the big three: diet, exercise, and sleep, things that we have more control over. Moving to cognitive development, so the cognitive domain, thinking and learning skills. Remember with Piaget, we talked about his fourth stage being the formal operational stage, and that being achieved in most individuals, many individuals, by adolescence. Well, there are many who agree with Piaget's ideas, but recognize that we continue to mature in our thinking, and that's the collective idea of post-formal cognition. Laura Overstreet in the video talks about post-formal cognition being the time when one is abstract, realistic, and personal. So that abstraction arriving with formal operations, but then rather than just thinking, of every pie in the sky possibility, being able to rein it in and think about what's realistic and then connecting that to personal application. We'll come across a couple of different theorists in this area. So Perry and Leboviv. Perry, you won't find that name specifically in our text, but you will see information about dialectical thinking or thought, which is also referred to as dualistic thinking. In the module and some of the videos in the module, you'll see the name Perry connected with that. So Perry studied individuals in college to see how their cognition continued to develop after the arrival of formal operations. And the idea of dualistic thinking is thinking of things just in, this or that, and then over the course of time, learning how to combine ideas and how to bring together complementary thoughts from opposing ideas. Lebovi-Vife then more about practical thought and cognitive affective complexity. Lebovi-Vife has a book that she authored that's called Integrating Emotional and Cognitive Development Through the Lifespan. So really looking at that interplay of cognition and emotions and that maturation. We'll be introduced to Shea in the Seattle Longitudinal Study in middle adulthood. And one of the big things that came out of Shea's study, it was a longitudinal study, or it was actually a sequential study, so it had a cross-sectional component and a longitudinal component, and I'll explain more of what that means in the middle adulthood section. But cross-sectional means getting a bunch of people of different ages and measuring them at the same time. Longitudinal, the same person measuring them over time. And what Shea discovered was the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence, that processing speed, and that tending to decline earlier than crystallized intelligence or that knowledge base. There's also information in the adulthood chapters about practical problem solving, expertise, and creativity. So practical problem solving, solving the problems of everyday life. So not just academic problems or theoretical problems, but how do you actually come up with solutions? You know, I laugh. I have adult children, young adult children, and they'll still every once in a while call me up because they need some help, quote unquote, adulting, right? Figuring out some of those practical things. How do I file my taxes? How do I get a credit card? How do I choose a doctor? Those kinds of practical problems. Expertise and creativity are certainly not the same, but they're connected. And as one becomes more expert, creativity that comes from that expertise tends to have a deeper level. I always say early creativity connected with adolescence and early adulthood tends to be more pow and wow, whereas middle adulthood, late adulthood, it tends to be more thought producing, more wow than pow and wow, if that makes sense. And then there's certainly information across the chapters about career. In early adulthood, I have you do a career exploration assignment. So early adulthood, often a time for training and settling into a career, entry into a career, and then getting more experience. And typically, middle adulthood, settling into a career, becoming maybe a supervisor, a mentor, a manager, and then by late adulthood, starting to think about retirement. Let's go ahead and look at our last domain, psychosocial. We're introduced the idea of emerging adulthood, not a universally accepted idea in terms of a standalone age period, but certainly a number of theorists who point to this idea of emerging adulthood, and in particular 18 to 25-year-olds, and this kind of extension of adolescence. So while in some ways one is an adult, right? In the US, when you're 18, you can vote and do other adulty things. And then 21, you get more privileges. It's really not till 25, though, that the brain fully develops. And for those that are going into careers that require advanced training and education, it's often not until, you know, up to the mid 20s before one settles into a career, sometimes even beyond that. We're certainly continuing to follow Erickson and each of his stages that he talks about in the adulthood years. So, intimacy, generativity, and then ego integrity, the ones that relate to the adult periods. We're also introduced to Levinson and Valiant. They have similar ideas that are somewhat extensions of what Erickson has to say. So Levinson looking at seasons of life, and life structures and entries and stabilizing periods within an age period, and then Valiant kind of breaking down Erickson further. So the tasks of the 20s, of the 30s, of the 40s and 50s, of the 60s and 70s. So the family life cycle is something that I actually introduced back in my introductory video, way back at the beginning of the semester. It's the idea of the stages that a family goes through from the beginning when one is born into a family and then grows up within that family, ultimately launches into their own life in typically early adulthood, and then more likely than not starts their own family, raises that family. Meanwhile, they're progressing from early adulthood to middle adulthood. Some of the responsibilities associated with early adulthood and raising adolescents and young adults, and then maybe starting to take some responsibility for the aging generation, their parents. So that sandwich that you'll learn about in middle adulthood, as someone in middle adulthood is being squeezed from above and below, trying to provide support to both the younger generation and the older generation, and then ultimately becoming the older generation oneself, taking on the role of being a grandparent and moving into retirement and then later life. So that's the family life cycle in a nutshell. We'll learn about different relationships. Some of the relationships to keep an eye out for are parent-child relationships. So we talked about parent-child relationships from the perspective of the child in the childhood chapters. Now we'll talk about parent-child relationships from the perspective of the parent in the adulthood chapters. Also, relationships with spouses, as well as changing relationships with siblings. Oftentimes, siblings become more companionate or more friend-like as they move into the adult years. Certainly not always, but often siblings will tend to come together when there is need to support aging parents. So having someone there that you can work alongside to try and help mom and dad. Other relationships include relationships with friends. Friends remain important throughout the lifespan, though the nature of friendships can sometimes change. It's not uncommon for us to start seeking out people in similar life situations. So when we're in early adulthood and raising young children, it's very common to befriend people who are in a similar life stage. Similarly, once we launch our children into their own lives, maybe send them off to college or off to their own adult lives, sharing stories with friends who are in a similar life situation can be very beneficial. Last topic here is possible selves and shift in time orientation. So possible selves are hoped for selves, what we hope to become, as well as feared selves, what we fear becoming. And we see possible selves certainly are something that's around throughout the lifespan, but becoming more transparent, if you will, as we move into and through adulthood and needing to shift some of our ideas as we age. And that relates somewhat to this idea of the shift in time orientation. So up until somewhere probably around middle adulthood, we tend to think about time in terms of how many years we've been on planet Earth, and then we shift our focus to how many years we have remaining on planet Earth. In middle adulthood, it can be eye-opening to realize that you have spent more years on the planet than you're likely to continue to exist on the planet, and that future time becomes shorter and shorter as you move through the adult years, and in particular into late adulthood, and need to start facing the idea of your own mortality. Okay, so that is just a quick overview of many different topics that you'll see come up as you go through the adulthood chapters. Take care.